All right, so I'm going to give a little bit talk on our political tradition. While I was kind of like writing this and doing this presentation, the presentation ended up being kind of like a little love letter to DC. So I hope you guys all enjoy the pictures I dug up. So basically, we're going to trace our political tradition from Marx down to where we are today with the Den for Communists and the Revolutionary Socialist Network and the Revolutionary Socialist Organizing Project. All right. So hopefully this presentation will answer some questions such as, what do the Den for Communists believe in? What does it mean to join? And why are we so cool and fun? I'll also give some historical context to our political positions in this organization. The historical part is based on the article written by Steve, who's here tonight. So that also helps with my nerves. It's great. But if you didn't read it, that's fine. Steve can answer your questions after this. Don't ask me anything. All right. So we'll start with kind of the 1800s. The first big internal split within the socialist movement was between Marxists and utopian socialists. Marx believed in the self-emancipation of the working class. For him, socialism was not inevitable, so therefore the working class would have to take power from the elite in an organized and educated revolution for socialism. On the other side of this sort of first split, the utopians, they didn't really base their, I guess, desire for socialism in class struggle at all. Their view was kind of that educating everyone about their ideas would basically eventually convince politicians or the elite to just do socialism. So they kind of wanted to lead by example and focus mostly just on education. We do think education is important, obviously, but Marxists are at the core materialists, and we believe that ideas will flow from material conditions. So in order to bring about socialism, we have to change those material conditions. So this split kind of boils down to democracy versus elitism and revolution versus reform, which is a theme that we'll see this whole time. We know the left loves to split up, so that's kind of what this first part's about. So the next little split that happened, and is still happening, as we all know, was between Marxism and anarchism. Anarchists believe that political authority is at the root of all exploitation and oppression, so therefore states in any form are inherently oppressive. On the other hand, Marx advocated for the dictatorship of the proletariat, or a workers' democracy, which is basically a state that would help to crush capitalism and then implement a transitional phase between capitalism and communism. As long as this sort of revolutionary party was a democracy of workers, Marx had confidence that it wouldn't devolve into tyranny. Of course, anarchists can't get behind that idea because they view all forms of the state as inherently oppressive. So clearly we take Marx's side in both of these early sort of discussions. The next big debate or split was between the revolutionaries and the social democrats, or the reformists. This kind of happened around the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, when the working class seized power, destroyed the capitalist state, and created a worker state. They were able to nationalize industry under the control of workers and suppress the capitalists. At the same time, the mainstream socialist parties rejected this method and tried to push the idea that electing a majority socialist party to government would be enough to just get rid of capitalism. They felt that the capitalist state should just be taken over by socialists as opposed to completely torn down and rebuilt. Clearly, the reform approach hasn't historically worked. There's still a few sort of social democrat governments in Europe that just coexist peacefully alongside capitalism and make no attempt to actually take it over. We see this in America today with the DSA trying to reform the Democratic Party, or just elect enough socialists to just do socialism. So the reform approach is kind of a top-down approach that relies on politicians to change the state as opposed to workers changing it for themselves. On the other side, we had the Bolsheviks, the revolutionaries, led by our boy Lenin. After their revolution in 1917, they turned their focus to creating a vanguard party that could encourage revolution internationally. For Lenin, this party would not be made up of elites and politicians, but it would be a militant, class-conscious section of the workers' movement that could convince the working class as a whole to take their power and overturn capitalism. I say almost every time we talk about Lenin that he would have loved Twitter, so I made him a Twitter. So he missed out, I feel. So even in this Bolshevik revolutionary wing, a split still occurred in 1920. While Lenin and the Bolsheviks rejected reformism, they were okay with fighting for reforms during periods of non-revolution. They took the stance that in times of non-revolution, the vanguard party should work with reformist workers in order to win partial gains. He called this a united front, and the revolutionaries also saw this as an opportunity to win fellow workers to the struggle against capitalism by going where the workers are, or as we like to say, intervening in social movements and labor struggles whenever possible. It's important to note that within the United Front, it was expected that revolutionaries should keep political independence and not capitulate to the reformists. They should be instead focused on bringing reformists into revolutionary politics. The other side of this split was basically ultra-leftism, which is what this quote from Lenin is about. Some felt that communists should only be engaging with other communists, which Lenin called infantile ultra-leftism, which I love. This is kind of another form of top-down socialism, since the idea behind it at its core is basically that the working class is too conservative or reactionary to create conditions for a revolution. So we have to like make them do it or do it from top down, basically. Clearly, we don't take that approach here. We think that a party is essential in ensuring a victory for workers, but only material conditions can create this situation. All right. Honestly, my brain kind of shuts down when I try to like do Stalin stuff, so I'll try. It's just all so chaotic and messy. But after the revolution, Russia was basically attacked and the working class was decimated. Stalin rose to power in this kind of chaotic time, like I said, and was forced to compete with the West. In order to do so, he had to accumulate capital at the expense of workers, which is clearly not very communist of him. He put his government into place, and then this is the quote I'm going to read that Steve wrote. And Stalin's government was based on the dispossession of the working class from political power and collective ownership of means of production. Stalin and his followers created theories to justify this counter-revolution as a continuation of the revolution. In reality, however, their rule was based on the destruction of that revolution and as such was anti-socialist. They created bureaucratic, I think someone has to mute if they can. They created bureaucratic state capitalism, rejected the two cardinal principles of Marxism and Leninism, which are internationalism and democracy. Instead of trying to spread the revolution, they talked of socialism in one country. This meant downplaying revolution and instead making government-to-government alliances with the capitalist West. So although Stalin claimed that his sort of approach was a continuation of Leninism, it was definitely not that. His government was another form of socialism from above and was actually a dictatorship over the working class as opposed to a dictatorship of the working class. So today, a lot of people who identified as Marxist-Leninists follow this tradition under Stalin, but since it is a rejection of internationalism and the self-emancipation of the working class, we are like, nah. All right, so on that side of Stalin, the side that we're on, we had Trotsky, who tried to preserve the ideals of Marx and Lenin while Stalin was doing his thing. He supported internationalism and democracy and stood on the side of workers around the world, even as Stalin was kind of like getting closer and closer to capitalists. Trotsky emphasized Lenin's ideals of forming united fronts with other workers' parties to gain immediate demands and urged workers to lead the movements and take them to socialist revolution. This is a theory called permanent revolution, and it's a central sort of core of our politics today. Trotsky was eventually run out of Russia and ice-picked by a Stalinist, so rip Trotsky. He would have loved Twitter too. By the time he died in 1940, the Russian state had degenerated and a form of capitalism had been restored in Russia, as the workers had kind of lost control and power to a new ruling class. Russia at the time was taking over Eastern Europe and imposing its sort of style of socialism onto the governments of those countries, which really started to influence sort of the idea of what socialism is. The left started to think that the idea of self-emancipation was not necessary because, you could just invade a country and make them socialist, which we are against because we are against any form of imperialism. So we don't see this as a viable way to bring about socialism. So from Trotsky, sort of developed our side of the leftist theory camp or tendency, I guess. And from that grew the international socialist tendency, which is sort of a loose grouping of Trotskyists that came out of post-World War II, sort of Trotskyism. This is kind of where we come from. This is where the ISO, which was our former party group organization, came from. So there's a couple important like theoretical ideas that come from the international socialist tendency. One, I lost my spot. One is the idea that Russia under Stalin was not a socialist country. We deemed it, or the IST deemed it, bureaucratic state capitalism, which is like a clear distinction from sort of the socialism that we are about. Another big one was party and class, which is the clarification of the relationship between the Revolutionary Party and the working class. Under Stalin, the party was conceived as a small group kind of ordering workers around. However, on our side, we believe that the working class cannot be led by small groups, even if they do have the right ideas. We see ourselves as wanting to build a vanguard party, although we're not there yet. But the vanguard party would need to be a large section of the working class, with the most militant and class-conscious workers leading the struggle. All right, so from the IST came the ISO, which was founded in the 70s and dissolved in 2019. There's a lot of reasons why it dissolved, sort of the ones that are always cited. There was a lot of movement of members towards the DSA or some contingents that wanted to support Bernie Sanders for president, which goes against our belief that we should be politically independent from the capitalist class and all of its parties. There was also a sexual assault and rape cover-up by the top sort of people that came out towards the end that was obviously not very cool. And so it was dissolved in 2019, and we kind of broke off to become us. So these various divisions and debates on the left are super important because it helps us distinguish us politically from other socialist groups, although we happily work with any of them to achieve common goals. Today there's four, someone else has to mute, I think. Today there are four main issues that divide the left. The first is the issue of self-emancipation versus elitist rule, which we've talked about a couple times. This is kind of this Trotsky-Stalin split is like the biggest one. And we, of course, believe in the self-emancipation of the working class and a democratic from below working class control of society, as opposed to top-down socialism that only requires a small group of people. Another big debate is if we should support people who run under the Democratic Party. We see that as being in opposition to Marxist principles of working class independence. Even socialist candidates such as Bernie Sanders or AOC do not get our support because we don't believe that true socialism can come from them, the top. Should Marxists support workers' struggle against ruling classes in all countries? This is a question that's coming up a lot, especially with the war between Russia and Ukraine. Some on the left defend oppressive regimes because they are enemies of the United States. PSL is one that's like really light on Russia right now. However, we understand that the main enemy is here at home in the form of US imperialism. And beyond that, we recognize that there are lots of enemies in the world, and the enemy of the working class anywhere is also our enemy. And so we stand in solidarity with working people of all countries against their oppressors. And then finally is, excuse me, should we be class reductionists, or should we combine the fight of exploitation and oppression alongside class struggle, which of course is the side we take. We fight against all forms of oppression. Steve says in that article that oppression is one of the most disgusting and revolting parts of capitalism. So a revolutionary movement that doesn't address oppression will never win over the working class. These fights have to be one and the same, because a victory against exploitation is a victory against oppression and capitalism, etc. So that's how we got to here, to us. I'm just going to do a super quick overview of the important stances and codes of conduct that we have in place, but all of these can be found on our website with lots more detail. Our Our points of unity is kind of what gives us our consistent and clear political outline for the goals and the beliefs of the organization. So I outlined kind of how we got to here and the stances that we've taken in historical debates. So this is kind of where our points of unity come from. The first one is for socialism against capitalism. We stand in the Marxist tradition of international worker action from below, organized, principled, and disciplined action informed by analysis of the state as an agent of the capitalist class and armed with the ability to strike. It just sounds so cool. Workers' power. We believe a socialist society can only be built when workers collectively take control of the wealth that we create and democratically plan its production and distribution according to present and future human needs instead of profit. Revolution. Capitalism must be replaced, obviously. The structures of the present government enforced by the police grew up under capitalism and are designed to protect capitalist rule. So the working class needs an entirely different kinds of state, a democratic worker state based on councils of workers. And internationalism. We impose imperialism, which is the division of the globe based on economic and military might, and support the self-determination of all oppressed people. We oppose settler colonialism and support sovereignty of all indigenous people from right here where we organize to occupied Palestine and everywhere in between. Full equality and liberation. We oppose white supremacy, misogyny, and all forms of oppression and acknowledge the compounding intersection of these oppressions. The liberation of the oppressed is essential to socialist revolution, and it will be impossible without it. The Revolutionary Party. To achieve socialism, the most militant workers must be organized into a revolutionary socialist party. The ruling class in capitalism is highly organized and very disciplined. To effectively oppose it, we need to meet it with our own discipline and organization and try to get mass mobilization of the working class. All right, this stuff can also be found on our website. But briefly, members are people who agree with our points of unity, have had at least one conversation with a current member and who pay our $5 a month fee or dues or have a sponsorship from a current member. We have a section on our website for routines and procedures that details how we make decisions and how disciplinary issues will be handled. That section also outlines the roles and responsibilities of the coordinating committee. And our code of conduct, which is centered around being respectful with everyone that we interact with in organizing spaces. Explicitly, we should not engage in any behavior or speech, even ironically, that reinforces any system of oppression. And we strive to be sensitive to others and not engage in exclusionary behavior. We have a lengthy sexual assault and domestic violence section on our page. Obviously, coming from the ISO, we want to take the most strongest sort of stance. We believe survivors, full stop. Therefore, we expel any member who is accused of sexual assault or domestic violence immediately and without investigation until direct and overwhelming substantive evidence to the contrary is supplied. We're not mental health professionals, and we do have survivors in our org, so we don't try to facilitate recovery of a perpetrator or reintegration. A member who has had any allegations of this sort brought against them would be immediately expelled from the organization and no longer welcome to attend meetings or events. All right, yay, look at this. We're almost there. So we answered kind of what we believe and what it means to join. So my final question was why the Denver Communists are so cool and fun. First, we are the only revolutionary socialist group in Denver that has a dead fasc on our hands. So that's pretty cool. We also love having dance parties and mocking the state at any chance that we get. Protests and stuff are serious, but we also always find joy in them. And we are also super passionate about bringing a better world, and we want as many people to join us. So yeah, if you have further questions, like I said, ask someone else because that's the most talking I've ever done in a meeting. Okay, love you, bye.